First, thank yous to Terence, who invited me, to Matthew and Jacob, who got me here, and to Carl, who has just introduced me. This is not the first time that I've spoken about William's work. I seem to be accompanying him all over the place, talking about it. But it is never tiring, and it is always new. And so with that, let me begin. Reading William Desmond has, for me, always involved three things. First, following the arterial system of a thinking at once intricate, blood red in that it is fully oxidized by insight, directed in its insouciant lack of apology regarding the rights of metaphysics and its non-systematic phenomenological aureole, and relentlessly creative in the push of thought and of language. Second, engaging in the manifold conversations with philosophers, religious thinkers, and literary figures conducted by Desmond, while also becoming adept in picking out which of them most nearly illuminates the issue that is the object of interpretation and interrogation. And three, thinking with Desmond regarding how one might complement his thought by bringing out new elements of the phenomena under investigation, further developing the important conversations he brings to light, and from time to time, introducing further conversations merely suggested in texts, which are every bit as rich in hints as they are in explicit discussions. My view is that since God and the Between, reading Desmond involves a fourth element, that is, paying particular attention to the intimate relation between philosophy and religion, and philosophy and Christianity in particular, in that the anti-Hegelian Desmond is entirely persuaded that while philosophy complements and supplements Christian revelation in crucial ways, not only can it not replace it, but it is oriented to and fructified by it. If this does not, strictly speaking, constitute Desmond as a Christian philosopher, it certainly constitutes him as a philosopher who rose against the modern tide in refusing to assert strict boundaries between philosophy and Christianity, and against the postmodern tide by insisting that the Christianity adduced as a conversation partner be historically recognizable in that it speaks to a robust form of transcendence. The intimate universal is no exception to this rule or set of rules, and I hope to illustrate this in this brief presentation, which, although keeps the entire text in view, will focus mainly on chapters 3, 7, and 8. The topic proposed for our consideration in the symposium by me here is community. Now, at first brush, this linguistic choice seems to be in equal parts apt and inept. Apt in that if one were to look for a synonym for what Desmond introduces as the intimate universal, community would perhaps be the first term that comes to mind. Inept in that the term community does not appear to do a great amount of conceptual work. While I would not want to claim too much for it, I think the choice helps us to see more clearly important features of the intimate universal, two of which I think stand out. The first is continuity of levels of relation and experience. In line with the Between trilogy, in the intimate universal, Desmond wants to say that as embedded in human beings' most basic experience, relationality or community goes all the way down. Second, community, if not necessarily communitarianism, can and should function as the norm whereby we can critically assess the governing social and political arrangements, especially those sanctioned by modern philosophy. I will do much of this excavation, particularly with respect to community, in the first part of my paper. But in line with my fourth hermeneutical protocol, I will highlight the contribution Desmond thinks monotheism makes regarding the integrity and fundamental orientation, the community of selves as they open up to each other. In section 2, I focus on Desmond's determined preference for the classical thought of Plato and Aristotle over modern and postmodern thought when it comes both to the articulation of political philosophy and the general philosophical principles and protocols on which it depends. I will also speak to the relation between Desmond's articulation of the more classical style of political philosophy of Plato and Aristotle and the articulation of the political philosophy of Eric Voegelin, both in his great history of political thought and in his classic Order and History. There is a third and final section in which I could have, but will not, talk about the relationship between Augustine and what I'm talking about, and hopefully that might come out in question. I actually have it written down, but it's quite clear that I'm not going to come in on the 35 minutes if I do that. And Terence already has struck the fear of God in me. So I'll just do two parts of this three-part affair. So the first part is called the archaeology of community and the genealogy of its laws, because Desmond is always doing archaeology and he's always simultaneously doing genealogy. In terms of what I have been calling community, the Intimate Universal has much to call on from the Between trilogy and Desmond's other work. The given togetherness, at once ontological and experiential, for Desmond is the matrix from which emerges non-linguistic and linguistic attempts to disclose a world, and from which participates out the artist, religious believer, and thinker, each of whom renders this world of togetherness in different ratios of participation and distanciation, with arguably philosophy as the most self-reflexive of discourses, having the greatest ratio of distanciation. This means that it is philosophy that has, paradoxically, the greatest capacity for forgetting and forswearing the participation that is the essential fuel of thought. And this capacity increases when philosophy insists on cutting itself off from relation with art and religion, which in general involve ratios of participation and distanciation more hospitable to the given. In the Intimate Universal, then, no less than in his previous texts, the archaeology of the given serves critically regarding a genealogy of decline. The community of being, which is everywhere, may not only be forgotten, but denied. While denial is always a possibility, it is especially a modern possibility, indeed a modern fact. And throughout his oeuvre, Desmond has spoken to numerous aspects of this loss. In this latest text, simplifying a very complex discussion, one could say that there are perhaps four essential forms of deformation which overlap and imbricate. The first, the emphasis on the individual in an essentially monadic constitution as either the fictive or real subject of philosophical and political discourse. That's a fall. A second fall, the second loss, the insistence on autonomy, and especially conatus essendi, as definitional of the individual or the group. A third loss, a third deformation. The determination that reason be the judge of individual and social performance and realization. And fourth, the confounding of ethos with the moral. We'll find out what the moral will mean here. I will treat each of these briefly in turn before I turn to speak briefly again of the function of monotheism in Desmond's latest text. So first about the individual. Archaeologically speaking, for Desmond in the intimate universal, it is the community of being that is primitive, not the individual. For Desmond, this is at once a metaphysical and anthropological proposition, since if Metaxou admits of an analysis of the complex relation of part and whole, anthropologically it renders the Lebenswelt, in which human beings embedded in the world experience the phenomena of the world through sense, art, language, tradition, and always with and reference towards others. Experience is not only not objectifying, but also, not strictly speaking, individual. Thus, when political philosophy erects the individual as a subject of discourse, it violates the priority of the given. In the case of modern political philosophy, which is a particular object of Desmond's concern, though there are other concerns in this text, this happens when the individual is the fictive subject within a theory of contract, or the supposed real subject in various forms of modern liberalism. A wrong interpretation of the individual is now sort of taken into account. As Desmond phenomenologically parses human being as the focus of experience, he insists on human beings' embodied, open receptivity to the world, other selves, language, culture, and tradition. This receptivity is the correlative of the indelible metaphysical structure of passio essendi. Again, the social or political philosophy that places the emphasis entirely on conatus essendi, or self-assertion, mistakes a part for the whole, and will thus inevitably go wrong. If we keep reason in brackets for the moment, we can readily see how two different forms of social and political philosophy fail due to their resting on this false assumption. One of these modern forms would, of course, be Hobbes, who, assuming the truth of conatus essendi as a full and proper description of human beings, advances a social and political philosophy intended to correct for the deleterious consequences of a state of nature that takes the form of perpetual struggle. The second form can be found in Nietzsche, which insists that this metaphysical truth of conatus essendi should lead to social arrangements that properly reflect struggle and its outcomes, rather than mitigate them. Third, Desmond has suspicions against the hegemony of reason. Desmond's archaeology of community is also genealogically set against the reification of reason, especially but not only in its connection to autonomy. Desmond has spoken out enough in his Between trilogy against the univocalizing instrumental reason for us to take it for granted that he presumes against the social and political philosophy that privileges the prestige of the expert and the manager. In this respect, he kind of more or less reminds of MacIntyre. The particular forms of social and political thought that are the main objects of censure in the intimate universal are Spinoza's rationalism on the one hand, and Kant's stipulation of rational autonomy on the other. But in practice, both make concessions to the given, in that Spinoza presumes that there may be a need for a positive political order, and perhaps a need for other discourses, such as the Bible, to rein in human passions. And Kant presumes that human beings will, as a matter of fact, fail morally. The logic of both of these positions make it impossible to give due weight to the other aspects of human beings. For instance, companionship, sympathy, and the needs and benefits of admiration and worship necessary for true human flourishing. And the fourth problem that Desmond despises, Desmond makes it every bit as clear in the intimate universal as he did in his previous texts, and especially in Ethics in the Between, which is a text I think that is most proximate to this one here, that ethics is a broader category than morality. especially morality as it gets defined in Kant outside of a relationship to a personal God. Now for Desmond, while the ethos for human beings connotes belonging and participation, the horizon is not that of pure immanence. The horizon is an open horizon and crucially does not exclude transcendence. If the pole of transcendence is necessary in order that the community is not to be immured in self-satisfaction and self-glorification, nonetheless, it is important that the transcendent pole is not entirely alien to the community of experience. Thus, Desmond's preference for the ethics of Plato and Aristotle as the pre-political foundation for politics and for political philosophy over what is offered in Kant. Similarly, his preference for Hegel over Kant, who would have thought, although as we shall see a little later, classical philosophy is also given critical purchase over Hegel, even if the ways Hegel is deemed to fall short of are quite different. Now, to evoke transcendence is to risk equivocation. In classical philosophy, transcendence concerns the irreducibility of value to the particular circumstances, or values, to the particular circumstances of their origin. Whereas in religion, and especially in Christianity, it refers to the gracious personal ground of reality. While Desmond analytically separates out these two different senses, he wants to acknowledge that historically speaking, these two forms of transcendence have reinforced each other throughout Western thought. And secondly, he wants to discourage philosophical purism, which would have it that a personal God can play no part in the construction of a viable social and political philosophy. The boundary between religion and philosophy, or the boundaries, are not simply contingently, but necessarily porous. Thus, modern attempts to set religion aside are violent, even when we're not talking about modern revolutionary forms of discourse that are intrinsically hostile to religion. And if, as Desmond believes, religion is an indelible form of expression of the community of being, its stipulated exclusion necessarily will lead to truncated and malformed social relations, as well as inadequate forms of political thought. Since the intimate universal is more prolegomenon to political philosophy than a political philosophy, strictly speaking, it would be unreasonable to expect Desmond to tease out to what extent a personal God can or cannot be invoked in modern political philosophy. But the question, I take it, can and perhaps should be asked. Second part of the text. Desmond on the exigence of classical political philosophy. It is no exaggeration to say that in significant respects, Desmond's thought represents a retrieval and a defense of classical philosophy. Of course, the defense concerns the general inspiration of classical philosophy as constituted by wonder and dynamically oriented towards a transsubjective ultimate reality that can be variously cast as truth, goodness, beauty, and, of course, oneness. And similarly, Desmond's retrieval of classical philosophy is far from automatic, in that the Irish philosopher processes classical philosophy in and through a complex set of filters. Phenomenology in its original inspiration beyond the pale of idealism that came to characterize it in the later Husserl. So first of all, phenomenology is a filter. Second, certain fruitful aspects of modern philosophy's concern with articulating the proper relation of part to whole and vice versa, thus Weiss and Peirce. And finally, the interdisciplinary perspectives on the porosity of discourses, such that religion and art are not simply objects of philosophical analysis, but can reciprocally inform philosophy at the most basic level of its conceptual framework, its fundamental sense of orientation and purpose, as well as its basic self-understanding. Given the relative prominence of Plato in the general Neoplatonic tradition throughout Desmond's work, the question can be asked as to whether Plato stands as a synecdoche for the classical tradition, or whether Desmond's retrieval is patterned after Aquinas and a number of 20th century Catholic thinkers, for instance, Erich Schivara, Edith Stein, and thus necessarily includes Aristotle as well as Plato. If the answer is that with regard to the articulation of the community of the between, it is necessarily both, because the philosopher is obliged equally to respect the community's immanent and transcendent dimensions, it is definitely the case that rhetorically, though not necessarily substantively, the accent falls on Plato. Although there are twice as many references to Plato compared with the references throughout the work to Aristotle, this fact in itself is not decisive, so counting doesn't get you very far. The reasons for Desmond's preference, therefore, have to be inferred, and even if the following reasons I'm just about to provide are in the strict sense conjectural, I feel subjectively secure in advancing them, which of course is always the case with O'Regan. He's subjectively secure. He's subjectively secure in the rhetorical moment where security sort of is something that is going to enhance the argument, at least. First, in my subjective security, in much of the modern and postmodern philosophy which Desmond feels called on to contest, it is the transcendent dimensions of truth, goodness, and beauty and unity that have been most brought into question. Although it would constitute a misreading of Aristotle to suggest that the transcendent dimension is absent in his work, for instance, the identification and metaphysics of being qua being with the highest being is only one of the many appearances of a transcendent dimension in Aristotle. It certainly is the case, however, that relatively speaking, the transcendent dimension is more prominent in Plato, as are also the emphasis on the ontological superabundance of origin and its excess relative to percept and concept. Plato and his tradition then can function for Desmond as strong witnesses for the prosecution that the general arc of modern and postmodern thought constitutes a derailment. Second, while no more than Aquinas does Desmond deny the advantages enjoyed by Aristotle when it comes to description and explanation of phenomena on the immanent plane, nonetheless, he is persuaded that Plato avoids the metaphysical and ontological dualisms of which he has been accused, and that consequently the difference between Plato and Aristotle on this account are incredibly exaggerated. The intimate universal reveals a Desmond who is no less attracted to classical political philosophy than he is to classical metaphysics, and who is no less convinced that its intrinsic value can be made more apparent and also amplified should it be processed through the three main filters which I analyzed previously. That is phenomenology, metaphysics of part and whole, and then the porosity of discourses. A significant part of the attraction for Desmond is that the political philosophies of both Plato and Aristotle rest on far deeper metaphysical and anthropological bases than is typical of modern political philosophies, whether the accent falls on the rationalistic or irrationalistic line, or whether there is a theory of contract or not. Another important feature is that both Plato and Aristotle acknowledge the primitive nature of the togetherness of human beings, as well as the reality of the quest for excellence, while on the one hand, allowing a place for individuals who are not reducible to the community, and on the other hand, being prepared to expose the complex nature of human beings who tend to be satisfied with inherited assumptions, afflicted by ambition and desire, and capable of acting against what moral judgment would enjoin and would justify. Again, as is the case with regard to classical metaphysics, Desmond shows himself to be cognizant throughout the intimate universal, but especially in chapter 3 of the contribution of each. In the case of Aristotle, it is important to Desmond that ethics is prior to politics, Politics is normed by ethics and not vice versa. Aristotle does not roll back Plato's revolution in thought, which makes the discovery of justice imperative and constructs it as the norm by which current political arrangements are judged. As Aristotle's ethical and political work indicates, the philosopher is especially interested in both finding and educating people whose general excellences make it likely that, precisely as embedded in the community, they can discern the demands of justice that are not reducible to that community. Aristotle's genius, therefore, is different from that of Plato in focusing on judgment and practical wisdom phronesis. Plato's genius is otherwise. It has to do with the transcendence of the good, which if it is participated in by human seeing and illustrated in actions within society, also functions as the measure for critique of societies and communities given over to imminent aims and satisfactions. By contrast with Alistair MacIntyre, who, given the challenges of modern thought and ideology, favors the retrieval of Aristotle over Plato, in light of modern Western political theory, which is increasingly immanentist and involves a general denial of transcendence, Desmond is inclined to emphasize the contribution of Plato as invoking the transcendence of justice and the good, but also availing of them as criteria to measure the degree of non-compliance in the societies and communities within which we live. If the classical tradition in general provides pre-political leverage over modern political realists such as Hobbes and Machiavelli, and over rationalists such as Spinoza, and an irrationalist such as Nietzsche, this is true in particular of Plato, who boldly asserts the reality of a transcendent value that many modern and most postmodern thinkers are anxious to deny. Desmond does not dispute the Aristotelian emphasis on the social embeddedness of our judgments. But for him, the history both of Western thought and culture demonstrates the need to mark a distinction between the social embeddedness of judgments of justice and good and their social construction. Affirming the former and denying the latter, Desmond is of the view that in the contemporary world, the Platonic accent needs to be struck, not only as Plato recognized can injustice routinely serve as a default, but in the contemporary world one faces the postmodern liquefaction of transcendent values and thus their liquidation. Although Plato's entire oeuvre is horizontally relevant for Desmond in the intimate universal, it is obvious that for Desmond, the Republic is the key text. And the reasons are not hard to find, and three come especially to mind. In the text, Plato argues with a passion and conviction unmatched in the philosophical tradition for a transcendent form of justice that is not reducible to an immanent value of a community. Second, the philosopher who manages to transcend the opinions or ideologies of the community is not justified in abandoning the community that is not regulated by justice, but rather has the responsibility to return to this community and to argue for correction of the governing social norms. And third, while there are other texts, for example, the Gorgias, in which Plato unveils the individual and social dynamics of power, arguably no other text in Plato tracks so clearly and expansively the mutation of power and energy from its productive and unobjectionable form to the form in which it becomes an end in itself. In the language that Desmond has developed over the years, he can say that in the figure of Thrasymachus, we can see the shift of gear from erotic sovereignty into that of the eros tyrannus, in which the only desire is for an increase of power that makes one invulnerable. Thus, if Nietzsche speaks against Plato in the intimate universal, Plato speaks back against Nietzsche, and perhaps nowhere more colorfully than in the story of Gyges' ring, which grants the owner invisibility and thus immunity from accountability. This is the end of the politics that would be faithful to the metaxological space within which we live and move and have our being. I will conclude sort of with a reflection on the relationship between Desmond and the thought of Eric Voegelin. Desmond's recovery of the Platonic reminds of Iris Murdoch and even more of Simone Weil, on whom Murdoch conceptually depends. This is not only for the reason that, as a matter of fact, Simone Weil has operative in a fragmentary discourse the concept of metaxu, but that Weil's thought is political in a way that Murdoch's is not, in that she directly addresses the situation of a thinker embedded in a community that is self-limiting in terms of its obedience to idols of its own making and moving towards the condition of the great beast in which injustice is a fundamental law of social reality. It would be rewarding to further probe these analogues and see what light they shine on Desmond's thought on the pre-political foundation of the political. I will not, however, pursue this line of inquiry here. The reason is not that I have sketched elsewhere the basic contours of these Platonic recoveries, I have, but rather that an even more illuminating analogy is ready at hand. I'm speaking of Eric Voegelin. Now, no more than in the case of Weil is the fact of the use of the concept metaxu the main reason, though Voegelin does have the concept of metaxu, or even an important one, in bringing Desmond into conversation with the author of the 5-volume Order and History and the 8-volume History of Political Thought. While both acknowledge the debt to Plato regarding the concept of metaxu, they parse it quite differently. Desmond not only does not borrow the term, a concept from Voegelin, who is the modern thinker that gives it more or less a central role in his thought. He gives the concept of positive metaphysical depth not provided by Voegelin, for whom the concept functions more or less negatively, to block exorbitant claims in modernity for knowledge and competence that involves the apotheosis of individuals and particular communities. Since Desmond in the Intimate Universal opens his reflection on metaxology, I have about 1 page to go, so not to worry, Terence. There is my conscience totally interjected, indicating my total vulnerability and so forth. Since Desmond in the Intimate Universal opens his reflection on metaxology to the political, his views allow for comparison with the thought of Voegelin, whose career is exercised by the quest for the pre-political foundations for the political, both in its operation and in its reflection. If the encyclopedic coverage of modern political systems and ideas in the history of political thought represents the critical genealogical side of Voegelin's explorations, Order and History represents an account of the emergence of pre-political norms in the ancient world, which are finalized in the thought of Aristotle and Plato, and which, for Voegelin, remain normative with regard to judging modern political systems and modern political thought. The Intimate Universal can be thought to recall both aspects of Voegelin's political philosophy, the first in its critique of major political theorists such as Hobbes, Spinoza, Schmitt, among others, the second in its acceptance that the thought of Plato and Aristotle, with, of course, you have to remember, suitable phenomenological filtering and these other adjustments, that this thought can function as normative when judging modern and postmodern political reflection as well as actual political arrangements. Desmond's rhetorical preference for Plato, not necessarily substantive preference for Plato, also seems to recall the similar preference in Voegelin, who is anxious to secure the trans-historical status of truth and goodness that are chronically vulnerable to being mere expressions of a group's value and self-understanding. And granted the far more extensive treatment of Plato in the 3rd volume of Order and History than what is on offer in the Intimate Universal, there are interesting overlaps when it comes to textual details. In his considered focus on Thrasymachus, as the antitype of Socrates, the thinker who maximalizes as well as makes explicit that power is the absolute value, Vogler sets, in some sense, the pattern for Desmond. And this is true also of Vogler's obvious fascination with the Ring of Gyges, which, of course, continues to have a life in the Western tradition, obviously most famously in Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings. Last paragraph. In picking out these textual details, Desmond pays attention in the way Verdun does to, I think, the literary form of the Republic, as well as honor its symbolism and studied recall of myth or story. Both philosophers acknowledge the importance of symbolism in the dialogue and the presence of myth, which is a condition of thought, while not being fully reducible to it. One is tempted to invoke the famous saying from an essay on Blake by Desmond's favorite poet, W.B. Yeats. Symbol and myth are, quotation, the only possible expression of an ungraspable essence, a transparent lamp about an invisible flame. In any event, in neither case, does thought totally overcome myth. Both Desmond and Vogler are more like Schelling than Hegel, more like Ricoeur than Bultmann, in thinking that symbol and myth are irreducible. Thank you.
Dr. Regan invites us to consider several senses of community and community. Most crucially, I think, Dr. Regan reminds us that Metapsu itself is a community. And Metapsu is nothing more, but also importantly nothing less than a community of humans, the sharing of humans between humans. Dr. Regan calls our attention to an important and yet essential feature of Desmond's metapsychology, namely that metapsychology is a philosophy of community. In one sense, metapsychology is a philosophy that is about community, that metaphysics is faithful to that Metapsu is always the articulation of the real community between real beings, whether that community be cast out as ontological, social, ethical, or theological. But in another sense, metapsychology is a philosophy of or from community, and that the logos of the Metapsu is always and only articulated from within the Metapsu itself. Dr. Regan shows us in ways specific and illuminating that Desmond's philosophy is a philosophy always aware of its own roots and its enduring obligation to the community. Following what Regan would say, we learn from Desmond that whenever we ourselves raise the philosophical question of being here now in the present, we are drawn out of ourselves into community. The community constituted, on one hand, by the whole tradition of philosophical questioning, the community between philosophy and its others, the community between the human being and the being of the world, and lastly, but perhaps most significantly, the community between the human being and God. In this multi-level community, there emerges what Desmond calls festivity. It's a genuine festivity within which we can enjoy that communion out of which would emerge the wonder that sustains us in long-standing philosophical questions. So I want to thank Dr. Regan for his contributions to this conference and draw upon the sense of community of his work. I'd like to indicate a sort of pose my own question. One of the senses of community raised by Dr. Regan. That's the community between religion and philosophy, between man and God. The section kicked out of me, but one of those interesting So we'll go there. In your paper, Dr. Regan, you identify several senses in which for Desmond, the given community of beings corresponds to because originated by and sustained through uniquely religious transcendence. The given Metapsu, if we find ourselves in outward, inward, upward, without as complicated origins. About the religiousness of the Metapsu, I have a question to pose to you as a theologian. So the question turns on two different senses in which religious relation to divine transcendence might be given. There is, say, the given religious relation natural to the Metapsu, so given in the sense of already there. And there is a religious relation established by revelation that has to be given to the Metapsu. The question is this: how would you chart the connection between the given religious relation at play in the If so, how would you sketch the relationship between this taxological species of natural theology, earlier or other species of natural theology, and its systematic theology, formed by revelation?
All right. See, everything was going well until he actually asked the question. In other words, that I basically sort of could have given you the third part of the paper for cheap, and I would really have escaped Cerberus over here, but apparently I did not. So let me actually try and answer the question. Right, of course, William is here, so he gets the last word on this, or rather, he gets the first last word because there is no last word. I take it so that Desmond, as a philosopher who allows religion into the conversation. In other words, Desmond, as a philosopher, and I don't want to, he's not a philosopher of religion in the strict sense. I mean, in any pragmatic sense, he's a philosopher of religion. But in the strict sense, he's not a philosopher of religion. He is a philosopher who forswears the forswearing of religion and its relationship to philosophy, or philosophy. He forswears the insistence of philosophy that it has no relationship with respect to some other discursive or performative other, right? Which historically, so we've had religions. So it seems to me, in that sense, you could regard sort of much of what he does as looked at from the other side of theologians. This is a form sort of natural theology, or it's a form of natural theology in a phenomenological register insofar as the forswearing is forsweared. Now, Desmond does more than that in the sense that pretty much like phenomenologists of religion, at least in God and the Between, for instance, we're going to discover that he's going to look at different types of orientation and religion who are going to have various ways of talking about immanence and transcendence. So religion, among other things, is going to have some transcendent pole. The question is, what is the degree of its vector? It will involve a complex negotiation between immanence and transcendence, because the kind of immanence that religion is an immanence which sort of will have to have something that's pulling it and pulling it out of itself. The question is, how much out of itself? How much verticality? How much alterity are we talking about? So there's this hospitality sort of to complex negotiation, complex figurations of immanence and transcendence, which if you are a phenomenologist of religion, or you are a Religionsgeschichte type, you might, with respect to some of the kinds of notes that Desmond strikes, say, well, I disagree sort of with this or that description and so forth. But overall, one understands precisely sort of what he is doing. Religion, if it is going to give you access to truth, or a claim to truth, or a claim to meaning, and a claim to meaningfulness, has to have more than immanent reserves. It has to be involved sort of in some form of relationality. Now, that gets to the question then, can we have supervening on that general description, right, a particular claim? So I'd want to say two things at least. Clearly, just simply in terms of intellectual performance, Desmond has suggested the possibility, maybe even the necessity, of talking about religion as it operates within a certain ordinance of transcendent immanence which favors the immanent, right? That would be a general description, shall we say, of pagan religions and so forth. Pretty much the same way Eric Voegelin sometimes talks about religion. And a religion sort of which is going to make a claim with respect to transcendence, whereby it's not just simply a claim to transcendence, but it's a claim with respect to that transcendence is the origin of the immanent order, of precisely the immanent order which is exercised sort of by transcendence. I take it that from a philosophical point of view is a definition of revelation. Now, that definition of revelation is, shall we say, a fundamental conceptual pattern which breaks up religion and doesn't univocalize religion. That is, minimally at least, we will have to talk about two forms of religion. And obviously, maximally, should one sort of get down and dirty, one might have to make further distinctions. You'd certainly have to make further distinctions within the immanent order, and we might have to negotiate different forms sort of religions of revelation. We might want to say, for instance, I can imagine, that the best form, you could argue, the best form of a religion of revelation would be an equal insistence on transcendence and immanence, which would, of course, sort of favor Christianity. Hegel actually made that sort of particular argument and so forth. Desmond doesn't like Hegel, but there's some formal elements of Hegel that many of us sort of can like, and we can agree formally, if not materially. Clearly, then, if you go to the theological register, right? So I want to allow that the boundaries between philosophy and theology are porous, but at the same time, they're not non-existent, right? Then from a theological point of view, because essentially what Desmond has done is he's given a taxonomy, which is a happy taxonomy for a theologian, right? It turns out that this sort of is a kind of taxonomy which, from the theological perspective, once you're on the other side of that not quite clear line, one can take advantage of, right? But that would mean then so that there's some degree sort of a resonance with respect to the description he has provided, a fairly formal description, and the kind of claim, for instance, that a Christian theologian would be forced to make. That is, a Christian theologian, and let's say a Catholic theologian in particular, I say in particular insofar as if we think about the history sort of the relationship between Catholicism or Christianity in the Catholic way and other religions, it has tended, for the most part, clearly not exclusive, for the most part to be a hospitable relationship, while of course also suggesting that there are inadequacies with respect to religion which they deem to be in the immanent realm. But it would allow then sort of for one to claim that revelation is something which on the one hand is prepared for insofar as with intimations, right? But this is a complex. On the one hand is prepared for, but on the other hand is not conditioned in a sense that revelation will always be unconditioned. So I take it so that something like that on the other side of the line is the transferable assets that are coming sort of from Desmond's hospitality towards religions in general and Christianity in particular, and that then would be the starting point, sort of, for theology. That clearly so is not the end point. So there's slightly different affections on either side of that line, but most certainly there's negotiation between them. That would be, I think, what I'd want to say.
One thing that I don't think that's been mentioned at all, suppose today yet, is this notion of the porosity of being, what I call the porosity of being. And it's very appropriate to the question in the following sense that if you look at the structure of the book, the first chapter is religion and the intimate universal. And I say in the introduction that it would be much easier for me to start with art, not only given our current zeitgeist, art is full of playfulness and possibility and so on, but there's something about religion. But this is the question of a sense of being religious that is more original. And I'm thinking here in the background to Hegel's concept of the notion of absolute spiritual, art, philosophy, art, religion, and philosophy, and religion at least in one particular understanding period, is after art. But I wanted to argue that there is a sense of being religious that constitutes the more original matrix, out of which the other patterns of human significance are artistic or philosophical or political emerge. So that sense of the porosity of being is, however, understood by me in an ontological sense. It's a very difficult concept to pursue because porosity seems to be a kind of emptiness in one sense. But to try and describe it as an opening of enabling power, for instance, it's not unlike Heidegger's aletheia, except what happens in the porosity is quite different to what Heidegger does with aletheia. His way of talking about aletheia is actually very violent. We have to wrest truth from out of the hiddenness, make it unhidden. And his language close to a sense of, so to say, any theological sense of the agapeic origin is on the other side of the porosity, creating this open space, which other forms of human significance can come to be. But that's a sense of being religious, which I think is ontologically constitutive of what it means to be human. And normally we tend to think of being religious vis-a-vis more determinate shapings of this original porosity between the human being and the divine. But I'm trying to argue here that there is this more original level, so that it's much more appropriate to start with religion in that sense than to have, say, religion later as a more sophisticated or articulate. But what I thought I had a copy of the Universal in my office here. I don't. It's empty. But there was a glossary made up for purposes from the back of my book. But what I read here of the porosity of being strikes me as all wrong.
From there.
I'm looking for a copy because it actually says a permeable boundary or open access between two determinate domains or things. And then it says on imus speak of. That must be one must speak. But I know there's more. I mean, I'm open to.
You wrote it, right? Here it is.
Right.
Well, it's French for
It's
printing purposes.
okay. No, even percent. Can I read it?
Oh. Sure. No.
Porosity often is taken to name a permeable boundary or open access between two determinate domains or things. It's often taken to name. We think of A and B as relatively firm, while between them there is some more or less open border, one not absolutely closed to passage. But how to think of passage as passage? One must speak of the medium in which passage occurs, but the medium is not a thing, but a field in which things and passage eventuate. Passage, porosity suggests a field in passage, itself a passing field, since it is not fixed or determinate. What if A and B are themselves marked by porosity? You would not then have things and events themselves porous. You would then have things or events themselves porous in a sea or field, itself a porosity. What passes would not pass as fixed in itself, but as itself passing in passage as such. I can't stop. And this is where the theological echo comes in. Here we might connect the porosity with creation. So some of the things that I'm saying, the theological analog to what's at issue I think is the doctrine of creation. The passage is creative in a porosity that passes between nothing and finite being, and between being and nothing again. And this passing is renewed again and again. So I'm talking about coming to be and passing away in this speed, in this porosity. So arising and being and setting, coming to be and passing out of being, creation brings to be the porosity within whose intermediate all things live and move and have their being. But how to get a fix on the porosity? There's no direct way. But it is revealed in human things, like the child's impressionability, the experience of being seen through, the blush, or the experience of music or prayer. So, if you look at that description of the porosity, you're looking at religion actually from the angle of the origin, so to say. And I think one of the reasons why in my work there is this openness between philosophy and religion is precisely because religion is the first living permeability, porosity, communication between the human and the divine. And if philosophy is to remain itself a living form of thought, it must always in some sense return to what comes up from that original porosity. Similarly with art, we talk about inspiration in art, but an analogous point applies there also. So I'm kind of wondering whether a lot of our discussion takes place after boundaries are already set. And you're going to get quite a different discussion than if you have forgotten this more original porosity. philosophers, and if that is remembered, the boundaries then in their relativity are much more easily granted, and actually one can dwell on those boundaries in a far more, if you like, agape, tolerant way towards others that do not necessarily present the same face as you yourself might normally find yourself comfortable with. I hope that's to the point, but again, don't trust the glossary that you were officially given today, because this is just a warning for hermeneutical. Be on guard.
Can I just make two quick comments regarding that? So I take it that's a reminder to me. Oh, no. This is your show. Two quick comments. One is a comparative comment. One of the figures with whom William can be compared, though with some degree of difficulty, since one is against metaphysics and one is for, is Jean de Marion. But I take it sort of that in Jean de Marion, early and late, sort of we have different negotiations of the relationship between philosophy and theology. In the first, he talks about the démarche, which is that porous boundary between philosophy and theology, or religion and conceptual thought. But of course, once he was attacked by Yannico and various others, that boundary is no longer porous. So we actually have a principle drawing of the boundary between philosophy and theology. So what you force me to do, this is my second point now, sort of is, what you force me to do is to make a further distinction. Obviously, I was talking about different sides of the line. Admittedly, I was careful enough to indicate that was a kind of muddy boundary, so I'm glad I did, given what William has just said. But it reminds me sort of, given what you have just said, we need to make a distinction between the issue of whether there's a principal boundary, which I take it sort of you contesting, and that sometimes just pragmatically, simply pragmatically, we draw a boundary. But a pragmatic boundary is not actually saying anything about the way in which different languages sort of have different influxive relationships with regard to each other. In my own case, since I was trained as a philosopher originally and became a theologian, it probably happens in the kind of the monad that I am, so that there's different fluxions, etc. Sometimes we may necessarily kind of draw pragmatic distinctions, and we draw pragmatic distinctions because we have different kinds of responsibility. So for instance, but it is pragmatic. As a theologian, I would be required, if I am in fact a theologian as opposed to sort of nominally a theologian, I am rightly required at some point or other to speak about Christ. I am rightly, as a Catholic theologian, at some point or other, required to speak about the triune God. Now, if I'm talking in a philosophical voice, and that's where I can go to the other side too, I'm not so required. So there are a set of pragmata that allow one sort of to, shall we say, be appropriate in one's discourse. But we're not to confound being appropriate with respect to a discourse, which is that the speakers of theology will speak in a certain way, just de facto, and the speakers of philosophy will exercise certain kind of ascetic things whereby they won't speak about certain things, right? So one will conform so to those pragmatic distinctions. But it may very well be that that is all that we're doing. Or if we're doing more than that, we don't know how much more we're doing than that. And certainly we are almost never, in fact, really hitting on an ontological, hitting on that there are different areas of reality which philosophy deals with and other different areas of reality that theology deal with.
I have to stand up now. It's my job. Thank you very much, Cyril Regan. And thankfully, we'll have some graduates talking about this permeable boundary in a moment.
Okay, good.